Canada sliced through mountains, tunneled under rivers, and carved a route across frozen wilds, all to move oil for 1,150 kilometers. It took years, $25 billion, and scores of engineers who faced avalanches, protests, and complex rules. But here's the twist. This mega project wasn't only about oil. It gave Canada long-sought independence, reshaped its future, and sent ripples through its top customer, the United States. This is the story of the Trans Mountain expansion and why it matters far beyond pipelines. Picture this. Canada pumps nearly 5 million barrels of oil daily. Yet in 2023, it sent 97% of that south to a single buyer, America. On paper, that looked like a solid partnership. But in reality, it trapped Canada in a one-way trade. Without direct access to world markets, Canadian oil companies, names like Suncor, Cenovus, and CNRL, had to sell at big discounts, sometimes $30 less per barrel than global rates. That meant billions of dollars lost each year. Money that could have funded communities, schools, and jobs. The heart of the problem was an old pipe. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, built in 1953, just couldn't handle modern volumes, which have jumped over 40% in 10 years. It mainly ran south, not west. That one-direction flow capped profits and tied Canada's hands on policy. The solution was obvious: reach new markets in Asia and Europe by building out to the Pacific. But that simple idea meant carving a new 1,150 kilometers corridor through some of the toughest terrain on Earth. In 2013, Kinder Morgan pitched a plan: lay a second pipe beside the first and boost capacity from 300,000 to 900,000 barrels per day. Easy, right? Not quite. Between 2014 and 2018, environmentalists, indigenous groups, and legal challengers paused the project. Protests blocked construction. Permits were revoked, and costs soared. In 2018, Kinder Morgan walked away until Ottawa stepped in, buying the line for 4.5 billion Canadian dollars. Suddenly, it wasn't a private gamble, it was a national mission. Work restarted in 2019 in 4 intense phases. The first challenge was crossing wetlands and farmland in Alberta. Engineers turned to horizontal directional drilling, a technique that threads pipe deep underground, like a giant GPS-guided needle, avoiding surface damage. This method let crews protect fragile ecosystems, while tunneling beneath streams and wetlands without open trenches. Next came the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia. Here, workers faced steep cliffs, landslides, and bitter winters. In some zones, teams advanced mere meters per day, blasting rock, shoring up each tunnel, and mapping every crevice. They battled avalanches and sub-zero winds for months. When slopes collapsed near Jacko Lake in 2022, work paused for weeks. Engineers then installed steel anchors, reinforced walls, and drainage systems to keep the mountain from collapsing onto the pipeline. West of the Rockies, crews tackled the original 1953 line. They reactivated 200 kilometers of dormant pipe, inspecting, cleaning, and upgrading it to today's standards. New pump stations rose along the route to keep oil flowing smoothly. Specialized welders worked day and night to hit tight schedules. Finally, at Burnaby on the Pacific, the team transformed a small terminal into the West Ridge Marine Terminal. They added 3 deep-water tanker berths, 19 high-capacity storage tanks, and cutting-edge spill prevention systems. This new gateway would let Canada load oil onto giant ships bound for Asia, Europe, and beyond. By May 2024, the last weld was capped, the pipeline pressure tested, and oil began flowing. Overnight, export capacity tripled from 300,000 to 900,000 barrels per day. Every meter of steel told a story of determination, innovation, and sheer grit. With that extra capacity, Canada broke its oil bottleneck. No longer tied to U.S. refineries, Canadian crude could head west to Pacific ports or loop east toward Europe. For decades, 97% of exports flowed south. That is now optional. In 2023, Canada reached a record 4.8 million barrels per day shipped overseas, a 3.4% jump, and oil exports were worth roughly 124 billion Canadian dollars, or 16% of the nation's total exports. Beyond volume, Trans Mountain brings money home. Experts project TMX could add up to 24 billion Canadian dollars to Canada's GDP each year. Over 20 years, producers might earn 73 billion Canadian dollar extra, and governments could collect 46 billion Canadian dollars in taxes and royalties. That pays for roads, hospitals, and schools. It also created nearly 38,000 jobs, 3,600 filled by Indigenous workers. and funneled over 6 billion Canadian dollars in contracts to indigenous-owned businesses. Between May and November 2024, China alone bought 2.3 billion Canadian dollars of Canadian oil. Europe stepped up too. Spain, the Netherlands, and others imported over 6.7 million metric tons in 2023. And hungry markets in India and Southeast Asia are next. Instead of begging for access, Canada now sits at the table with choices. And that's true energy sovereignty. This newfound freedom didn't go unnoticed in Washington. For decades, Canada's 97% export share to the US was a two-way street, predictable and easy. But as TMX opened new routes, the US faced a choice. When talk surfaced in early 2025 of a possible 10% tariff on Canadian energy, that warning shook markets. American refineries, built for Canada's heavier crude, can't quickly switch to lighter grades without costly upgrades. Suddenly, both nations saw their mutual dependence and vulnerability in a new light. With Trans Mountain, Canada no longer needed to funnel every barrel south. It could load tankers for Shanghai, Rotterdam, or Mumbai. That shift gives Canada bargaining power it never had before. Negotiate freight rates, pipeline tariffs, and trade deals from strength, not necessity. It's not about cutting ties with the US. It's about ending the single buyer trap and balancing energy diplomacy across 3 oceans. As Canadian tankers sail west and east, US refineries risk losing their most reliable supplier. Yet swapping to other crude grades means expensive retrofits, up to hundreds of millions per refinery, and years of downtime. Both sides have skin in the game. Now, energy policy talks in Ottawa and DC carry new stakes. Canada can no longer be held hostage by one market, and the US can't assume Canadian oil will always flow south. The Trans Mountain expansion rewrote the rules. It's more than an oil line, it's a lifeline to choice. Canada transformed from a pipeline-locked outpost to a global player. Its biggest neighbor must now reckon with a partner that has options, and that changes the energy chessboard. What started as a pipeline to move oil turned into a symbol of independence. Canada sliced through mountains not just for barrels, but for freedom. Now, as tankers steer toward Asia and Europe, both sides face a new reality of shared risk and balanced trade. If you found this peek into megaprojects and geopolitics eye-opening, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Which big-scale engineering story should we explore next? Thanks for watching.